I need someone to oversee our delivery operations in the Southern District, Helen explained. It would mean managing a team of drivers, ensuring customer satisfaction, and helping us expand our services in that area. The salary would be $60,000 a year, plus health insurance and a company vehicle. David felt like he couldn't breathe. $60,000 was more than twice what he made from all his delivery jobs combined. Health insurance would mean his mother could get the surgery she needed. A company vehicle would mean he could finally stop worrying about his old car breaking down. I don't understand, David said quietly. Why me? I don't have management experience. Because I've learned that character matters more than experience, Helen replied. I can teach you everything you need to know about running operations. But I can't teach someone to care about people the way you do. Helen stood up and walked over to her window. I started this company 25 years ago with one truck and a lot of determination. I know what it's like to struggle, to work multiple jobs, to worry about paying bills. But I also know that success means nothing if you don't use it to help others. She turned back to David. I want to offer you this position, but I also want to do something else. I want to start a foundation that helps families like Tommy's get the medical equipment and support they need. I'd like you to help me run it. David felt tears forming in his eyes. I don't know what to say. Say yes, Helen said with a smile. Say yes to changing your life, and say yes to helping us change other people's lives too. 3 months later, David was sitting in his new office wearing a suit he never thought he'd own, planning routes for a team of 20 drivers. His mother had gotten her surgery and was feeling better than she had in years. His old Honda had been replaced with a reliable company truck. But the best part of David's new life was the foundation. In just 3 months, they had helped over 50 families get wheelchairs, crutches, and other medical equipment they couldn't afford. Tommy had been their first success story, getting a brand new, properly fitted pair of crutches that would last him for years. David kept a photo on his desk of himself, Tommy, and Lisa at the foundation's first fundraising event. Tommy was wearing a small suit and tie, beaming with pride as he helped hand out equipment to other children who needed it. You know what I learned? David said to Helen during one of their weekly meetings. My grandfather was right. When you help others, you really do end up helping yourself in ways you never expected. Helen smiled. That's exactly why I knew you were the right person for this job. David's story had come full circle, from a struggling delivery driver to a successful businessman who was helping hundreds of families. But he never forgot that it all started with one simple decision to help a boy with broken crutches. Sometimes, David realized, the smallest acts of kindness really can change everything. 2 weeks passed after David's encounter with Tommy and Lisa. Life had settled into a new routine that felt warmer and more meaningful than before. David still worked his delivery job 7 days a week, but now he had something to look forward to beyond just paying bills. Every few days when David had deliveries at Riverside Apartments, he would stop by to see Tommy. Sometimes they would just talk in the hallway for a few minutes. Other times, if David had finished work early, Tommy would show him around the neighborhood, or they would sit on the apartment building's front steps and share stories. Tommy had become like a little brother to David. The boy was smart, funny, and had an incredible positive attitude despite all the challenges he faced. He never complained about needing crutches or about his family's tight budget. Instead, he talked about his dreams, his favorite subjects in school, and his plans to help other people when he grew up. Lisa had invited David for dinner 3 times, and each meal had felt like being part of a real family. Lisa was an amazing cook, even though she had to work with simple ingredients and a tight grocery budget. More importantly, she and Tommy made David feel welcome and appreciated in a way he hadn't experienced in years. David had also started helping Lisa with small repairs around their apartment. A loose cabinet door here, a squeaky hinge there. Nothing major, but Lisa was grateful for any help she could get. She worked so much that she barely had time to sleep, let alone fix things that broke. During one of their dinner conversations, Lisa had told David more about her situation. Tommy's father had left when Tommy was just 3 years old. Right after they learned about Tommy's condition, Lisa had been on her own ever since, working multiple jobs to support them both. Some days I wonder if I'm doing enough for him, Lisa had confided to David. I want to give him everything other kids have, but there's just never enough money. You're doing more than enough, David had assured her. Tommy is one of the happiest, most well-adjusted kids I've ever met. That's because of you. What David didn't know was that Lisa had been talking about him to her co-workers at the hospital. She couldn't stop telling people about the stranger who had fixed her son's crutches without asking for anything in return. One of Lisa's co-workers was a nurse named Patricia, who had been working at City General Hospital for over 20 years. Patricia had heard Lisa's story about David several times, and each time it touched her heart a little more. Patricia's daughter worked in the office of a successful businesswoman named Helen Montgomery. Helen owned a large logistics company that handled deliveries for major retailers across 3 states. Her company employed over 500 people and was always looking for good, reliable workers. Patricia mentioned Lisa's story to her daughter during a family dinner one evening. There's this delivery driver who secretly fixed a disabled boy's crutches, Patricia said. The mother I work with can't stop talking about how kind and selfless this man is. Patricia's daughter, Jennifer, found the story interesting enough to mention it to her boss the next day at work. Helen Montgomery was known for being tough in business, but she also had a soft spot for stories about people helping others. Helen had built her company from nothing, starting with just one delivery truck and a dream. She understood what it was like to struggle and work multiple jobs just to survive. More importantly, she believed that a person's character was more important than their resume. Tell me more about this delivery driver, Helen asked Jennifer. Jennifer relayed what she had heard from her mother, about David secretly repairing Tommy's crutches and the friendship that had developed between them. Helen listened carefully, asking questions about David's work ethic and reliability. That same week, Helen decided to do something that surprised even her own employees. She asked Jennifer to get more information about David, including which delivery companies he worked for and what his regular routes were. Helen had been thinking about expanding her company's delivery services, and she needed someone to oversee operations in the southern part of the city. It was a position that required someone trustworthy, hardworking, and genuinely caring about customer service. Most importantly, Helen wanted someone who would treat her company's customers the way David had treated Tommy, with kindness, respect, and genuine concern for their well-being. After some research, Helen learned that David worked for 3 different delivery apps, often 12 hours a day, just to make ends meet. She found out about his old car, his mother's medical bills, and his general financial struggles. Helen also discovered that David had never been late for a delivery, never had a customer complaint, and had received dozens of positive reviews praising his politeness and reliability. On a Thursday morning, Helen made a decision that would change David's life forever. David was just finishing his morning coffee when his phone rang. The caller ID showed an unknown number, which usually meant a telemarketer or a wrong number. He almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. Hello, is this David? A professional-sounding woman asked. Yes, this is David. Who is this? My name is Helen Montgomery. I own Montgomery Logistics Company. I was wondering if we could meet to discuss a business opportunity. David was confused. He had never heard of Montgomery Logistics, and he couldn't imagine what kind of business opportunity someone would want to discuss with him. I think you might have the wrong person, David said. I'm just a delivery driver. No, I have the right person, Helen said firmly. I've heard about what you did for a young boy named Tommy and his mother Lisa. I'd like to meet with you to discuss a job opportunity. David felt his heart start beating faster. How could this woman know about Tommy and Lisa? And what kind of job opportunity could she possibly have for him? I don't understand, David said. How do you know about that? It's a long story, Helen replied. But good news travels fast, especially when it's about someone with genuine character. Are you available to meet this afternoon? David looked at his delivery schedule. He had 8 orders lined up, but none of them were urgent. I guess I could meet for a few minutes. Where did you want to meet? Helen gave David the address of her company's main office building downtown. David had driven past it many times during his deliveries but had never paid much attention to it. Now, as he looked it up online, he realized it was a much bigger operation than he had imagined. That afternoon, David put on his best shirt and drove to the Montgomery Logistics building. His old Honda looked out of place in the parking lot full of newer cars. But David tried not to let that bother him. The receptionist directed David to Helen's office on the 15th floor. As the elevator doors opened, David felt more nervous than he had in years. He had no idea what to expect from this meeting. Helen Montgomery was a woman in her 50s with gray hair and sharp, intelligent eyes. Her office was impressive but not flashy, with large windows overlooking the city and walls covered with awards and photos of company events. "David, thank you for coming," Helen said, standing up to shake his hand. "Please, have a seat." David sat down in one of the comfortable chairs across from Helen's desk, still confused about why he was there. "I'm sure you're wondering why I asked you here," Helen began. "Let me start by telling you a little about my company. We handle logistics and delivery services for major retailers. We employ over 500 people, and we're growing every year." David nodded, not sure what this had to do with him. "The thing is," Helen continued, "as we grow, it becomes harder to find people with the right character to represent our company. We can teach someone how to use our computer systems or how to plan efficient routes, but we can't teach someone to be kind, honest, and genuinely caring about others." Helen leaned forward in her chair. "Through a series of connections, I heard about what you did for Tommy, how you spent your own money to fix a stranger's crutches, how you did it secretly so the family wouldn't feel embarrassed, and how you've continued to be a friend to them, even though you have your own struggles." David felt his cheeks getting warm. It really wasn't that big of a deal. "But it was a big deal," Helen said firmly. "It was exactly the kind of thing that tells me what kind of person you are, and that's why I want to offer you a job." David blinked in surprise. A job? The next morning came too quickly for David. He had slept better than he had in weeks, but he still felt tired. Maybe it was because he had stayed up late working on Tommy's crutches, or maybe it was the nervous excitement he felt about what Tommy would discover that morning. David went through his usual routine: coffee, shower, checking his phone for delivery orders. But his mind kept drifting to the 3rd floor of Riverside Apartments. He wondered if Tommy had left for school yet. Had he found the note? How did he react when he saw his crutches looking almost brand new? Around 8:30 in the morning, David's phone buzzed with a delivery request. His heart skipped a beat when he saw the address. Riverside Apartments. Someone had ordered groceries for delivery that morning. David tried to tell himself it was just a coincidence. Lots of people lived in that building, and he delivered there several times a week. But as he loaded the grocery bags into his car, he couldn't help but hope that maybe, just maybe, he might see Tommy and find out how the boy had reacted to his surprise. When David arrived at Riverside Apartments, he parked in his usual spot and gathered the groceries. The delivery was for apartment 2A, which meant he'd have to walk past the stairs that led to Tommy's floor. His heart was beating a little faster than normal as he entered the building. As David climbed the stairs to the 2nd floor, he heard voices coming from above. Someone was talking excitedly, and David could hear footsteps moving around on the 3rd floor. He tried to focus on his delivery, but he couldn't help but listen. "Mom, look at them. They're perfect." It was Tommy's voice, filled with joy and amazement. David smiled to himself as he knocked on the door of apartment 2A. The woman who answered looked tired but friendly. She was getting ready for work, dressed in scrubs that suggested she worked at a hospital or clinic. "Thank you so much," she said as David handed her the groceries. "You're a lifesaver. I completely forgot I had an early shift today, and I didn't have time to go to the store." "No problem at all," David replied. "That's what we're here for." As the woman closed her door, David heard more excited voices from upstairs. His curiosity got the better of him, and instead of heading straight back to his car, he decided to walk up to the 3rd floor. When David reached the top of the stairs, he saw Tommy standing in the hallway with his mother. The woman looked to be in her early 30s with kind eyes and dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. She was wearing a uniform that David recognized from the local hospital where his own mother had been treated. Tommy was standing tall and proud, using his crutches, to move back and forth down the hallway. But these weren't the same broken, dangerous crutches from yesterday. They looked completely different. The rubber tips were new and secure. The metal parts gleamed like they had been polished. The padding looked soft and comfortable. "I can't believe someone would do this," Tommy's mother was saying, her voice filled with emotion. "Who would spend their own money to help a stranger?" Tommy was beaming as he demonstrated how well the crutches worked. "Look, Mom, no more wobbling, and these rubber tips don't slip at all. I can walk so much better now." David stood at the top of the stairs, not sure if he should interrupt or quietly walk away. He felt a warm feeling in his chest watching Tommy move around with such confidence and joy. Tommy's mother noticed David first. "Oh, hello," she said with a smile. "Are you making a delivery?" "Yes, ma'am," David replied. "Just finished one downstairs. I couldn't help but notice that Tommy seems happy about something." Tommy turned toward David with a huge grin on his face. "Someone fixed my crutches. Can you believe it? They were completely broken yesterday, and this morning they're like new." David pretended to be surprised. "Really? That's amazing. They do look great." "We found this note," Tommy's mother said, holding up the small piece of paper David had left. "It just says it's from a friend who cares. I wish I knew who it was so I could thank them properly." Tommy moved closer to David, his eyes bright with excitement. "I think I know who did it," he said quietly. David felt his heart skip a beat. "Oh? Who do you think it was?" Tommy looked directly at David with a knowing smile. "It was you, wasn't it?" David was caught completely off guard. He had been so careful, working in the dark when no one was around. How could Tommy possibly know? "What makes you think that?" David asked, trying to keep his voice casual. "Because you're the only person who helped me yesterday," Tommy said. "And because you have kind eyes. My mom always says you can tell a lot about a person by looking at their eyes." Tommy's mother looked back and forth between David and her son, beginning to understand what Tommy was suggesting. "Wait," she said slowly. Did you fix Tommy's crutches?" David realized there was no point in denying it anymore. Tommy had figured it out, and his mother deserved to know the truth. "I just wanted to help," David said simply. "I saw how much trouble Tommy was having yesterday, and I knew those crutches were dangerous." Tommy's mother put her hand over her mouth, and David could see tears forming in her eyes. "You spent your own money on parts to fix a stranger's crutches?" "It wasn't that much," David said, though they all knew that wasn't entirely true. Tommy moved toward David and, without warning, wrapped his arms around him in a tight hug. "Thank you," the boy said, his voice muffled against David's jacket. "Thank you for caring about me." David felt his own eyes getting watery as he hugged Tommy back. It had been a long time since anyone had hugged him like that, with such pure gratitude and affection. Tommy's mother wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "I'm Lisa," she said, extending her hand to David. "And I can never thank you enough for what you've done." "I'm David," he replied, shaking her hand. "And really it was nothing. Anyone would have done the same thing." "No," Lisa said firmly. "Not anyone. Most people would have walked by and minded their own business. You saw a need and you filled it, even though it cost you money you probably couldn't afford to spend." David was surprised by how accurately Lisa had assessed his situation. "How did you know I couldn't afford it?" Lisa smiled sadly. "Because I recognize the look. I see it in my own mirror every morning. We're all just trying to get by, doing the best we can with what we have. But you gave up something you needed to help my son. That's not something most people would do." Tommy was still holding on to David's arm as if he was afraid David might disappear. "Are you going to be our friend now?" the boy asked hopefully. David looked down at Tommy's eager face and felt something shift inside his chest. For months, he had been so focused on his own problems and struggles that he had forgotten how good it felt to connect with other people. "I'd like that very much," David said. Lisa looked at her watch and sighed. "I hate to break this up, but I have to get to work. I'm already running late." "Where do you work?" David asked. "City General Hospital," Lisa replied. I'm a nurse's aide in the children's ward. I work there during the day and clean office buildings at night. David nodded, understanding exactly how exhausting that schedule must be. That's a lot of work. It pays the bills, Lisa said with a shrug. Most of them, anyway. Tommy looked up at his mother. Mom, can David come have dinner with us sometime? Lisa smiled at her son's enthusiasm. If David wants to, he's welcome any time. David felt touched by the invitation. I'd really like that. As Lisa gathered her things to leave for work, she turned back to David one more time. I still can't believe you did this. Tommy's been struggling with those broken crutches for weeks. I've been trying to save up to buy him new ones, but every time I get close to having enough money, something else comes up. I understand, David said. I've been there. The thing is, Lisa continued, this means so much more than just having working crutches. It shows Tommy that there are good people in the world who care about others, even strangers. That's a lesson. Worth more than money? Tommy nodded seriously. David taught me that there are people who help just because it's the right thing to do. After Lisa left for work, Tommy asked if David could stay and talk for a few more minutes. They sat on the stairs together, and Tommy told David about school, his friends, and his dreams for the future. I want to be a doctor when I grow up, Tommy said, so I can help people like you helped me. That's a great goal, David said. I think you'd make an excellent doctor. Will you still come visit us even when you're not making deliveries here? Tommy asked. Of course, David promised. We're friends now, remember? As David finally prepared to leave and continue his workday, Tommy called out to him one more time. David? Yeah? You're the best friend I've ever had. David felt his heart swell with emotion as he walked back to his car. He had woken up that morning wondering if his secret act of kindness had made a difference. Now he knew it had changed everything. Not just for Tommy, but for himself as well. For the first time in months, David felt like he was part of something bigger than his own daily struggles. He had a friend who looked up to him, and a purpose that went beyond just making ends meet. Little did David know that his story was just beginning, and that his simple act of kindness was about to change his life in ways he never could have imagined. David woke up the next morning with his grandfather's words still echoing in his mind. He had barely slept, tossing and turning as he thought about Tommy and those broken crutches. Every time he closed his eyes, he could see the boy struggling down that hallway, determination mixed with pain on his young face. As David got ready for work, he made a mental list of everything he needed to do that day. He had 12 deliveries scheduled, his car needed gas, and he had promised to call his mother to check on how she was feeling. But underneath all of these regular tasks, one thought kept pushing its way to the front of his mind. He had to do something about Tommy's crutches. David had learned basic repair skills from his grandfather over the years. When he was growing up, every weekend meant helping Grandpa fix something for someone in the neighborhood. A leaky faucet for Mrs. Johnson next door. A squeaky door for the family across the street. A wobbly table for his elderly neighbor who lived alone. His grandfather had a small workshop in the garage, filled with tools that David had learned to use. Screwdrivers, wrenches, sandpaper, wood glue, metal polish. David remembered the smell of that workshop, a mixture of oil and sawdust that somehow made everything feel safe and fixable. Every problem has a solution, his grandfather used to say while they worked together. Sometimes you just have to be creative and patient to find it. After his grandfather passed away 5 years ago, David had inherited some of those tools. They were packed away in a box in his closet, rarely used since he'd been so busy with work. But now, as he thought about Tommy's broken crutches, David realized he might finally have a good reason to dust them off. Before starting his deliveries that morning, David drove to the hardware store on Pine Street. It was a small, family-owned shop that had been in business for decades. The owner, Mr. Rodriguez, knew David from his occasional visits when something broke in his apartment. "Morning, David," Mr. Rodriguez said as David walked through the door. "What brings you in today?" David explained what he needed without going into too much detail about Tommy. He asked about rubber tips for crutches, replacement screws, and padding for the armrests. Mr. Rodriguez listened carefully, then led David to the back of the store where they kept medical supplies and repair parts. These rubber tips come in different sizes, Mr. Rodriguez explained, showing David several options. You'll need to measure the bottom of the crutches to get the right fit. These screws here are stainless steel, so they won't rust or wear out quickly. And this padding is designed specifically for medical equipment. David looked at the prices and felt his stomach tighten. The rubber tips cost $12 for a pair. The screws were $8. The padding was another $15. Including tax, he was looking at almost $40 total. David thought about his own budget. He had been saving money for weeks to get his car's brakes fixed. The mechanic had told him it was important to do it soon for safety reasons. That repair was going to cost him $200, and he was still $60 short. If he spent $40 on supplies for Tommy's crutches, he'd be even further away from being able to fix his car. But then he thought about Tommy, struggling with those dangerous broken crutches, and he knew he couldn't walk away. "I'll take all of it," David told Mr. Rodriguez. "Working on a project?" Mr. Rodriguez asked as he rang up the items. "Something like that," David replied, not wanting to explain the whole situation. David spent the rest of the day making his deliveries, but his mind was elsewhere. He kept thinking about the best way to approach fixing Tommy's crutches. He couldn't just knock on the apartment door and offer to help. That might embarrass Tommy or his mother, and David didn't want to make them feel like charity cases. He needed to find a way to help without making it obvious that he was helping. It had to look natural, maybe even accidental. Around 3 o'clock that afternoon, David had a delivery at Riverside Apartments again. This time it was groceries for an elderly woman on the first floor. As he walked up the stairs, he glanced toward the third floor, wondering if Tommy was home from school yet. After completing the delivery, David walked up to the third floor, telling himself he was just checking to see if the crutches were still there. Sure enough, they were leaning against the wall outside apartment 3B, just like yesterday. David looked around to make sure no one was watching, then quickly examined the crutches more closely. The damage was even worse than he'd thought. One of the screws was so loose that the entire top section wobbled when he touched it. The rubber tip on the left crutch was hanging by just a thin strip of material. These crutches were an accident, waiting to happen. If Tommy fell because of them, he could get seriously hurt. David knew he had to act fast. That evening, after finishing all his deliveries, David went home and got his grandfather's tools out of the closet. He hadn't used them in months, but they were still in good condition. He selected what he would need: a screwdriver set, some sandpaper, metal polish, and a small flashlight. David waited until it was completely dark outside. He didn't want anyone to see what he was doing, not because he was ashamed of helping, but because he wanted Tommy and his family to be able to accept the help without feeling embarrassed or obligated. Around 10 o'clock at night, David drove back to Riverside Apartments. The parking lot was quiet, with most residents already inside for the evening. He parked his car and gathered his supplies, including the new parts he'd bought earlier. David climbed the stairs to the third floor, moving as quietly as possible. The hallway was dimly lit by a single overhead light, but it was enough for him to see what he was doing. The crutches were exactly where Tommy had left them. David set up his small flashlight to give him better lighting, then got to work. First, he carefully removed the old broken rubber tips. They were so worn that they came off easily. The new ones fit perfectly, providing a secure, non-slip surface that would keep Tommy safe on any type of floor. Next, David worked on tightening all the screws. Some of them were so loose that he was amazed the crutches hadn't fallen apart completely. He replaced the most worn screws with the new stainless steel ones he'd bought, making sure everything was tight and secure. The padding on the armrests was dirty and torn. David carefully removed the old padding and replaced it with the new, softer material. He made sure it was positioned correctly so it would be comfortable for Tommy to use. As David worked, he thought about his grandfather and all the times they'd fixed things together. He could almost hear his grandfather's voice encouraging him, telling him to take his time and do the job right. The repair took almost an hour. David worked slowly and carefully, making sure every detail was perfect. He used the sandpaper to smooth out rough spots on the metal. He applied metal polish to make the crutches look cleaner and newer. When he was finished, David stepped back to examine his work. The crutches looked almost brand new. They were sturdy, safe, and comfortable. Most importantly, they would allow Tommy to move around without fear of falling or getting hurt. David gathered up his tools and the old broken parts. He didn't want to leave any evidence of what he'd done. As he was getting ready to leave, he had an idea. David pulled out a small piece of paper from his wallet and wrote a simple message. For a brave young man, stay strong, from a friend who cares. He folded the note and tucked it under one of the crutches where Tommy would be sure to find it. As David walked back down the stairs, he felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time. It wasn't just satisfaction from fixing something that was broken. It was deeper than that. For the first time in months, David felt like he had done something truly meaningful. He thought about his grandfather again and smiled. The old man would have been proud of what David had done tonight. Not just the repair work, but the decision to help someone who needed it, even when David himself was struggling. David drove home that night feeling lighter somehow, despite the fact that he was now $40 further away from being able to fix his car. He had given up something he needed to help someone else, and somehow that felt exactly right. As he got ready for bed, David wondered what Tommy would think when he discovered the repaired crutches in the morning. Would he be surprised? Happy? Would he figure out who had helped him? David hoped that Tommy would simply be grateful for the help and wouldn't worry too much about where it came from. Sometimes, David thought, the best kind of help is the kind that comes without strings attached, without expectations, and without the need for recognition. He fell asleep that night with his grandfather's words in his mind. When you help others, you end up helping yourself in ways you never expected. David had no idea how true those words were about to become. The rain was coming down hard that Tuesday afternoon. David pulled his old car into the parking lot of Riverside Apartments and turned off the engine. He sat there for a moment, listening to the raindrops hitting his windshield. His phone buzzed, with another delivery notification. 3 more stops after this one, and then maybe he could call it a day. David had been doing delivery work for almost 3 years now. It wasn't his dream job, but it paid the bills. Well, most of them anyway. He was 28 years old and still struggling to make ends meet. Every month felt like a race against time, trying to earn enough money before the rent was due. His mother had been sick for the past year, and her medical bills kept piling up. The doctors said she needed surgery, but their insurance only covered part of it. David worked 7 days a week, picking up orders from different food delivery apps, grocery deliveries, and anything else that would bring in some extra cash. His car wasn't in great shape either. The Honda was 15 years old, and every few weeks something else would break. Last month it was the air conditioning. Before that, the radio stopped working. David kept telling himself he'd get a better car someday, but that day seemed to get further and further away. He grabbed the grocery bags from his back seat and ran through the rain toward the apartment building. The Riverside Apartments weren't fancy, but they were clean and safe. Most of the people who lived there were working families just like David, trying to get by and take care of their loved ones. As he climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, David heard a sound that made him stop. Someone was struggling. He could hear heavy breathing and what sounded like something scraping against the floor. When he reached the 3rd floor, he saw where the sound was coming from. A young boy, maybe 10 or 11 years old, was trying to walk down the hallway using a pair of crutches, but something was wrong with them. One of the crutches had a broken rubber tip that was barely hanging on. The other one had loose screws that made it wobble with every step. The boy was having a hard time keeping his balance. David watched as the child tried to make his way toward apartment 3B. Every step looked painful and difficult. The boy would take a step, pause to steady himself, then take another careful step. His face was red from the effort, and David could see sweat on his forehead despite the cool weather. The boy's name was Tommy, though David didn't know that yet. Tommy had been born with a condition that affected his legs. He'd been using crutches since he was 6 years old. They weren't perfect, but they helped him get around and do most of the things other kids could do. He could even play some sports, with his friends at school. But yesterday morning, when Tommy was getting ready for school, his crutches had started falling apart. The rubber tip on the left one had cracked and was hanging by just a tiny piece. The screws on the right one had come loose, making it shake every time he put weight on it. His mom had tried to fix them with some tape, but it wasn't working very well. Tommy's mother worked 2 jobs to support them both. She left for work early in the morning and didn't get home until late at night. Money was always tight, and she'd been saving up for months to buy Tommy new crutches. But every time she almost had enough saved, something else would come up. The car would need repairs, or the electric bill would be higher than expected, or Tommy would outgrow his school clothes. She had called 3 different medical supply stores that morning, hoping to find used crutches that might be cheaper. But even the used ones cost more than she could afford right now. She'd promised Tommy they would figure something out soon, but in the meantime, he had to make do with the broken ones. David stood there watching Tommy struggle, feeling his heart sink. He recognized that look of determination mixed with frustration. It was the same look he saw in his own mirror every morning when he was trying to figure out how to pay all his bills with not quite enough money. He wanted to help, but he wasn't sure what to say. David had always been a quiet person, and he didn't want to embarrass the boy or make him feel bad. But he also couldn't just walk away and pretend he hadn't seen anything. Finally, David cleared his throat softly. "Hey there," he said in a gentle voice. "Are you okay?" Tommy looked up, a little startled. He hadn't heard David approaching. "Oh, hi," Tommy said, trying to smile. "Yeah, I'm okay. Just trying to get to my apartment." David could see that Tommy was far from okay. The boy was breathing hard, and his hands were shaking from gripping the wobbly crutches so tightly. "Those crutches look like they're giving you some trouble," David said. Tommy looked down at his crutches and sighed. "Yeah, they broke yesterday. My mom says we'll get new ones when we can afford it. But for now, I have to use these." David felt a knot forming in his stomach. He thought about his own struggles with money, but at least he could walk wherever he needed to go. This boy depended on these crutches just to move around, and they were falling apart. "Is your mom home?" David asked. Tommy shook his head. "She's at work. She won't be back until really late tonight. She works at the hospital during the day and cleans offices at night." David nodded, understanding exactly what that meant. Tommy's mother was working herself to exhaustion, just like David was, trying to keep their family afloat. And here was her son stuck with broken equipment that he needed just to walk. "What apartment are you trying to get to?" David asked. 3B, Tommy said, pointing down the hall. "It's just a little bit further." David looked at the distance Tommy still had to cover. It wasn't far for someone who could walk normally, but with those broken crutches it might as well have been a mile. "Here, let me help you," David said, moving closer. "You can lean on me if you need to." Tommy smiled for the first time since David had seen him. "Thanks, that would be great." Together they slowly made their way down the hallway. David walked beside Tommy, ready to steady him if he started to fall. It took several minutes to cover what should have been a 30-second walk. When they reached apartment 3B, Tommy pulled out his key and unlocked the door. "Thank you so much," he said to David. "You're really nice." David helped Tommy get inside, safely, then delivered the groceries to the apartment he'd originally been heading to. But as he walked back down the hallway, he couldn't stop thinking about Tommy and those broken crutches. On his way back to his car, David noticed that Tommy had left his crutches leaning against the wall outside his apartment door. They looked even worse up close. The rubber tips were completely worn through in some places. The metal was bent and scratched. The padding on the armrests was torn and dirty. These weren't just old crutches, David realized. They were dangerous. If one of them broke completely while Tommy was using it, the boy could fall and get seriously hurt. David sat in his car for a long time, thinking. He had 3 more deliveries to make, but his mind kept drifting back to Tommy. The image of that brave little boy struggling down the hallway wouldn't leave his head. That evening, after David finished his last delivery, he drove home to his small apartment. But instead of relaxing like he usually did, He found himself looking up information about crutches on his phone. He wanted to understand how they worked and what kinds of repairs they might need. He learned that the rubber tips were crucial for preventing slips and falls. Without good tips, crutches could slide out from under someone, especially on smooth floors or wet surfaces. He also read that loose screws could cause a crutch to collapse without warning. David realized that Tommy was in real danger every time he used those crutches. But new crutches cost several $100s, money that Tommy's family clearly didn't have. As David lay in bed that night, he couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about Tommy's smile when he'd helped him down the hallway. He thought about the boy's mother, working 2 jobs and still not able to afford the basic equipment her son needed. He thought about his own struggles and how hard it was to make ends meet. But mostly he thought about what his grandfather used to tell him when he was growing up. His grandfather had been a handyman who fixed things for people in their neighborhood, often for free if they couldn't afford to pay. "David," his grandfather would say, "when you see someone who needs help, you don't walk away just because it's not your problem. You help because it's the right thing to do. And sometimes when you help others, you end up helping yourself in ways you never expected." David had never forgotten those words, but lately, he'd been so focused on his own problems that he'd forgotten to look around and see who else might be struggling. Now, lying in the dark, David made a decision that would change everything.